The question at the heart of the book, Political Tribes, Group Instinct and the Fate of Nations, is, well, it's maybe the most urgent one facing us today. Can America still rise above tribe at the very moment its politics, both foreign and domestic, just seem to be collapsing into warring camps?
It's a powerful diagnosis of national fracture, and we believe that some books must be challenged, really challenged.
Absolutely.
So this critique uses, as appropriate, a step-by-step critical thinking framework. It maps claims to evidence.
Okay.
We also apply an intellectual framework to get at the book's core purpose, and we use the Golden Rule and the U.S. preamble to find any ethical asymmetries.
And then what?
We conclude with a logical analysis and a balanced conclusion.
And for you, listening right now, we want to be clear about what you're hearing.
Yes.
You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. It's powered by Google's Notebook LM, and it's designed for a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
Our mission here is to cut through the noise. We want to show you not only what the author believes, but also where the blind spots, the vulnerabilities in her argument might be.
That approach feels crucial for this book because its purpose is, as you said, diagnostic.
It is. It's less about telling us what to do and much more about explaining why everything we have been doing keeps failing.
So what's the central thesis?
The central thesis is that policy and politics misfire constantly when planners focus on these grand, abstract ideals.
Like democracy or capitalism?
Exactly, while completely neglecting the messy, on-the-ground reality of group loyalty.
Okay, so the author builds this on three foundational claims. Let's start with the first one, the psychological bedrock.
All right. She asserts that humans are inherently and deeply tribal. Group identity is often far more powerful than any ideology.
Meaning people will kill and die for their group, not for an economic theory.
Precisely, for ethnic, religious, or sectarian affiliation. That's claim number one.
Okay, and claim number two takes that idea and applies it to U.S. foreign policy.
Yes. The book argues U.S. elites have repeatedly misunderstood or just actively ignored these tribal dynamics abroad. She points to Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq,
Even Venezuela,
places where the U.S. saw a global chessboard of ideologies instead of a tangled web of local vendettas.
Which leads to claim number three, where she brings that painful lens right back home.
Right back to the United States. She argues that both the political left and right are now locked in this self-reinforcing, zero-sum identity politics.
And this is what's eroding that historical supergroup American identity she talks about.
Let's pause on that idea of the supergroup for a second.
Good idea.
When she talks about a shared civic framework, what she means is that historical belief that all these different subcultures,
Regional, religious, ethnic.
all of them, could operate within one common system, a system defined by the Constitution, the rule of law, and some shared non-negotiable civic values.
So like a civic roof over many different cultural rooms.
That's a perfect way to put it. And this is where the diagnosis becomes a question.
The big question.
Can that civic we still be rebuilt today? Especially without just erasing the painful historical asymmetries of power that many groups suffered under that very same roof.
Right. How do you address old wounds while also convincing people to reinvest in a shared future? That's the challenge.
It is.
Okay, so let's unpack this with the evidence. A diagnosis is only as strong as its case studies, and the foreign policy chapters are. Well, they're vivid.
They really are. What's fascinating is the detail in the historical misreadings. Take the Vietnam War. The U.S. saw it as a critical front in the global fight against communism.
Just one monolithic enemy.
One monolithic enemy. They categorized everyone based on that single metric.
But the reality on the ground was so much more complicated, driven by, what, ancient resentments.
Absolutely. The author explains that the U.S. completely ignored the fact that many of the local anti-communist capitalists they supported were actually an ethnic Chinese minority.
A minority that was historically despised by the ethnic Vietnamese majority.
Exactly. So by framing the conflict purely ideologically, American planners accidentally aligned themselves with a locally hated, powerful, and exclusionary ethnic group.
So the war wasn't just about communism at all.
Not at its core. It was about who held local power and who was seen as the exploiter.
That is just a staggering oversight. And the book argues that this same pattern repeats itself again and again.
It does. You see it in Iraq, where the U.S. failed to grasp the sheer depth of the Sunni-Shia divide. It wasn't some temporary political squabble.
There's a deep identity conflict.
Unleashed the moment Saddam's power vanished. And it was the same in Afghanistan. Grand national goals just collided with these layered Pashtun-Tajik-Hazara rivalries that actually define local authority.
So the broader critique of American behavior is that we keep showing up with a philosophy textbook looking for nation-states and grand ideals.
When we should have been looking for textured local hierarchies, clan loyalties, and generational resentments.
It sounds like an intellectual habit among our elites.
It suggests an inability to see people as they are, as tribal animals, and an insistence on seeing them as they should be, as rational, abstract, ideological actors.
And this is where the argument gets really provocative, because the book takes that same tribe lens and turns it on the domestic sphere.
Right. She argues we are replicating the exact same blind spots right here at home. We view our political fights as rational policy debates.
When there are actually clashes between deeply embedded cultural groups.
She spends a lot of time on what she calls the elite tribe, a coastal, professional, highly educated class. They share a distinct language, media, a set of cultural signifiers.
And this tribe, she suggests, often views provincial or working-class communities with a kind of, disdain.
A dismissive disdain, yes.
Yeah.
Regardless of race.
And what's the evidence she uses for this conflict between domestic tribes? It's not just geography, is it?
Oh, it's multifaceted. She points to the polarization of media, where one side barely registers the cultural reality of the other. She highlights language. The words used in elite publications or on campuses can instantly signal if you're in the in-group or the out-group.
And she uses the 2016 Trump campaign as a flashpoint.
As a major flashpoint. The book argues that both progressive identity politics and populist nationalism are fundamentally forms of tribalism. They're group-level struggles for recognition and status.
What feels crucial there is that these tribes feel existentially threatened by each other. It's not just about tax rates.
No. It's a zero-sum battle over which group's values will dominate the culture. It creates the cycle of fear and exclusion.
The professional class fears losing a cosmopolitan, inclusive future, and the populist base fears losing a specific traditional cultural status.
Structurally, the book is very unified conceptually. Tribalism is the thread that organizes everything from counterinsurgency in Afghanistan to fights over statues. It's a very clean framework.
I do wonder if that clean unity masks some structural unevenness.
How so?
Well, if you look at the evidence, the international cases like the deep history of Vietnam feel so empirical, but the domestic sections feel more interpretive, more cultural observation than hard data. Do you think that weakens the argument?
That's a fair criticism. Some reviewers have pointed that out. While she expertly diagnoses the symptoms of domestic tribalism, the fear, the clustering, the underlying causes get less attention.
Especially the economic shifts that hollowed out those provincial communities.
Exactly. Those are treated less exhaustively than the cultural dynamics. That decision does shift the focus away from economics and onto culture.
Let's shift now to what many see as the most challenging part of the book, the ethical analysis.
Okay.
One of its great strengths is its refusal to demonize any single group. It treats tribalism as a universal human constant, a psychological feature, not a bug specific to one party or one backward nation.
Yes, that even-handed diagnosis is a virtue, but it immediately introduces this crucial ethical tension. Critics argue that while the book treats all groups as psychologically understandable, the analysis sometimes blurs the critical asymmetries between dominant and subordinated groups.
Yeah. Not all tribes start from the same place.
Not at all. Not the same place of historical power or material risk.
And that's where the golden rule test comes in, isn't it? The book calls for mutual empathy.
For each tribe to treat the other as they wish to be treated.
But the unresolved tension is that the book spends less time on concrete remedies for the entrenched power imbalances that stop true reciprocity from even being meaningful. You can't just empathize away a structural disadvantage.
And if we connect that to the ideals in the U.S. preamble goals like establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, the book's diagnosis is undeniably sharp. It identifies the chaos perfectly.
But the ethical program for actually addressing the underlying injustice
remains underdeveloped. It offers a kind of high-level hope for civic renewal, but is light on the political mechanics of repair.
This leads right to the core criticism reviewers highlight.
Yeah.
Is it really intellectually honest to equate left-wing identity politics, which is often rooted in fighting for civil rights,
and against historical exclusion,
with right-wing ethno-nationalism, which is often about defending an already dominant historical status?
The material stakes are just vastly different. An oppressed group's fear of violence or discrimination is not morally symmetrical with a dominant group's fear of losing cultural status.
So when the book uses the single label tribalism for both,
It risks minimizing that massive difference in consequences.
a further challenge comes up when we think about that supergroup American identity the book wants to revive. Did we ever really achieve that ideal unity?
A very pointed question.
Given the history of slavery, Jim Crow, exclusion acts, was that unity just a privilege for the white majority? Does revival just sound like nostalgia for something that never fully existed for everyone?
That's the crux of the historical debate the book invites. If the common civic culture was conditional and exclusionary, then simply asking people to return to it isn't enough.
You have to actively build something new, something that resolves those historical betrayals.
Precisely.
This feels like a good place to pause for a moment of reflection. The kind of reflective interlude featured on Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, and podcasts that inspire reflection and rational thought.
As a reader and a citizen, maybe consider these questions. They really challenge the book's core assumptions.
Number 1. When does recognizing group difference genuinely honor human dignity? And when does it tip over into a zero-sum competition for status or security? Where's that line for you?
Number 2. What would it mean concretely to build a national identity that is both emotionally resonant, that people feel deeply connected to, and also honestly attentive to past and present injustices? What would that actually look like?
And number 3, in your own daily life, in your smaller tribes, your family, neighborhood, political circle, where do you see that human instinct to exclude, and how might the golden rule restrain it in practice?
These are the questions we need to keep alive to move beyond the diagnosis this book provides. Now, let's wrap this up with a logical analysis and a final, balanced verdict.
Okay, on the positive side, the logical virtues are very clear. That central concept, tribalism as group instinct, it's the engine of the whole argument.
It gives the work tremendous coherence, strong explanatory power. It makes these complex geopolitical failures intelligible to non-specialists without burying them in jargon.
But critics also push back hard, arguing the theory is, well, too elastic.
Too flexible.
Right. If almost any conflict, from a civil war to a campus disagreement, can just be redescribed as tribal, then you risk obscuring the specific measurable causes.
Things like institutional decay, specific economic shocks, or rigid ideologies.
Exactly. If the answer to everything is just tribalism, the word risks becoming meaningless.
Or worse, a cynical justification for doing nothing. Another logical challenge is about the proposed solution. Reviving an inclusive American civic identity sounds appealing, but it can also sound like nostalgia for a unity that, as we discussed, many marginalized groups just never experienced.
It risks minimizing the historical fact that for many people, that supergroup identity was always conditional on their subordination.
It does.
So, where do we land? What's the final word?
Ethically and intellectually, the most productive way to read Political Tribes is as a challenging but partial lens. It absolutely sharpens our perception of how powerful group loyalties are.
It forces you to look beyond simple economic explanations for foreign policy disasters and domestic polarization.
But it must be supplemented. It has to be read alongside accounts that center structural factors like class power, institutional design, the historical reality of race more explicitly.
So if you read this book as a necessary corrective to overly intellectualized policy, you'll gain immense insight.
But if you read it as the only answer to the country's problems, you'll find its ethical program is incomplete.
It gives you a shortcut to understanding the nature of conflict, but it leaves the heavy lifting of justice up to us.
And this critique draws on a systematic framework that emphasizes mapping an author's claims to evidence, testing assumptions, probing ethical asymmetries through the Golden Rule and the U.S. Preamble, and concluding with a logically balanced assessment of both strengths and weaknesses.
And that broader framework is a reminder for you, the listener, to remain alert to sources of bias, your own and the author's, and to use books as occasions for disciplined reflection, not as tribal ammunition.
Well said.
For those ready to take this analysis further, click the link for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.